Okay, we should be live now, which means I'll put this over here. Okay, Methodism in America. First off, it'll work. There we go. The founders, obviously, John Wesley. He was an Anglican theologian, Oxford graduate. A really big key figure in the First Great Awakening. In fact, some might argue the most important, the most key figure in the Great Awakening. With just he was kind of an introverted guy normally, but when he got into the pulpit, he was he was on fire. He was electric, and was just a super charismatic preacher. Although he wouldn't have a whole lot to do in America, necessarily, but America affected him more than he affected America. We'll put it that way. But Methodism in America was, as we'll get to, a huge thing. He was brother Charles. Charles was a preacher too, and Charles was a very good preacher. But he was predominantly, his passion was in hymn writing. He was a hymn writer, and as we'll get into each of these guys in a little bit more detail in a sec. But yeah, you've heard the work of Charles, and then finally you have George Whitefield. George Whitefield, ironically, wouldn't have been a Methodist. Obviously, Methodism, as we know it today, came about pretty much long after all of these guys' deaths. But George Whitefield, in particular, he would have not been, even if Methodism had it. Like, if they came back from the dead, raised ghosts, they would be like, hey, George Whitefield. Honestly, all three of them probably wouldn't be Methodists, but George Whitefield especially. He was, once again, Anglican preacher. He was big on the outdoor sermons, which John and Charles both would engage in as well, but nobody quite like him. He's said to have been, have 18,000 sermons, and he'd get thousands of people at a time. Benjamin Franklin would be there, and he's another one of those big names, top 5, not top 3, in the First Great Awakening. But going into each of them specifically, John Wesley here, and I realize my camera's in the way of, I don't think it blocks anything else, but theology is what my face is currently blocking. That's what that says. And yeah, so he was Anglican. He grew up Anglican. His parents were, I believe, if I remember correctly, Puritan dissenters. But very religiously strict. But the base of his theology was prevenient grace, which would be the ability to accept grace despite original sin. This would be the Arminian perspective. Fundamentally, you would have two perspectives: the Arminian and the Calvinist. The Arminian would be that your grace as we know it, basically, you are dead in your body is dead. A dead body can't do anything except receive grace. So you would have the Armenian approach that would say that the human, that you and I, everybody, we would have the ability to reject God's grace. That God would offer us our grace and we can choose to take it or reject it. The Calvinists would say that is unresistible. That if God says, hey, here's the grace, you can't say no. God would tell you, too bad, you're taking it anyway. So Wesley would fall into the Armenian camp of prevenient grace, where you do have that choice to deny or accept it. Justification by, I said type grace alone, faith alone. Yeah, he would argue that, no amount of works can lead to salvation by themselves. He would believe, however, that once you accepted Christ, once you got that justification by faith, right, that faith that would activate that, right, from that point you would get sanctified. And once you are sanctified, your works, he would still not believe that works were essential, but he would say that sort of your eyes have now been opened, that you accept the faith, right, and now you're justified, and now you're saved, right? You're saved. However, your eyes have also been opened, and you now sort of understand, you sort of have a clarity now of how to better act and how to better do everything right. So that would be the justification by grace. Perfection is possible through sanctification. This was a huge thing for Wesley. If you go and you read any of his biographies, sort of any accounts about him, you'll learn that he was a perfectionist, and a lot of his personal issues really came out of that fact that he was a perfectionist. He wanted to be perfect. He wanted to be the ultimate godly man, and he couldn't. It just wasn't going to happen. And that was something that really tore him up a lot, as seen throughout his life. Universal atonement. This is another sort of anti-Calvinistic approach, which would have said that that when Christ died on the cross, that was not to sanctify, or sorry, to save the elect and a select group of people that were chosen at some point, whenever God deemed it fit, whether that was before creation or not, but at some point, an elect group decided, right? Wesley would say, no, everybody is saved through Christ. That this is universal atonement, not for a specific group. He would believe that through the Holy Spirit, one can be guided towards saving grace. This would kind of tie in a little bit with that sanctification idea, where justification, right, by grace, that would be conducive of, accepting the Holy Spirit into your body, into your heart, into your soul, right, and allowing that transformation of you internally, and that would then lead to sanctification, and then that would lead to, and then sort of that clarity I was talking about with that sanctification. That's kind of what we're seeing here with, through the Holy Spirit being guided, right, towards that saving grace. And then finally at the bottom, the heart religion. We'll get to that a little bit more later, but that was what Methodism would come to be known by, as a result of sort of experience Wesley had with on Aldersgate Street. We'll get to that, but just know that it was considered early on sort of the heart religion. That was how it was described. Key events in Wesley's life are in 1709. I believe he was 5 years old, 4 or 5. He was a young child. The rectory where his father was the priest of caught on fire. And in I thought I have it next. I do. In Stephen Tompkins' biography, he would explain how the foundations of the house were completely burned away, and yet the house was still standing. And it wasn't until John Wesley was in sort of the attic, and so everybody was out of the house except John Wesley, and basically the foundations of the entire house were burned away. The house was essentially floating, and it was not until John Wesley was removed and taken out of the room he was finally saved that the house actually collapsed, as it should have. Obviously, it was floating without lack of foundation. So this was obviously a huge thing. His mother would continually tell him that, he is alive through the providence of God, and that God's got plans for you, and that, you're going to set the world ablaze, right? You're gonna ignite a fire in people's hearts and spirits for God. And that is where sort of the symbol of the flame, the Methodist symbol, would be a flame on the cross, and that's really where it came from. There's a couple other fire sort of ideology or symbolism in Methodism, but that would be the main one. In 1720, Wesley and his brother Charles would form the Holy Club. This was sort of like a strict sort of the Oxford. He would go to Oxford, and he was not impressed. He was like, "Yeah, these guys are just a bunch of rich kids wasting their time." And he wanted actual spiritual growth. He wanted to, once again, going back to the idea of he wanted that godly perfection. And so they would form a study group, sort of this study group, Bible study, which was focused on rigorous spiritual discipline. And so just almost like borderline monastic in a lot of ways. Think of an Oxford monastery. That would kind of be what he was getting at. And the other students would kind of poke fun at him and his brother and anybody else in this group and call them the Methodists. And so that's the earliest use of the term Methodist, was kind of as a little bit of a poking at them. In 1735 to 37, he would transition to Georgia, or he would go to Georgia. 1735 he would lead 37. Well, it says he was there for 18 months, so 1735 to 37 roughly was when he was in America. And he had a really life-changing experience. He engaged with the Moravian Brotherhood's leader, sort of they had the American branch named Augustus Gottlieb Spangenberg. He would cause Wesley to rethink his faith. When essentially Spangenberg asks Wesley, "Do you have the Spirit inside of him?" They have this conversation where he's like, "Do you have the Spirit inside of him?" He's like, "I hope so." And then Spangenberg was like, "Well, are you saved through Christ?" And he's like, "I hope so." And he really couldn't give like a definitive answer. I'm not doing it just a conversation, but essentially, in that moment, Wesley realized he couldn't really give like a definitive answer to a lot of just basic questions regarding. He kind of realized that he himself was more spiritually lacking than he thought he initially was. So there were also experiences with the Moravian Brotherhood on his journey over that would affect him pretty heavily, but that would be the main one too. And then upon returning to London, he would attend the Moravian Church on Aldersgate Street, and in a reading of the Martin Luther's Prelude to the Romans, he would describe his heart as having become strangely warm, and this is what is kind of marked as the true birth of Methodism. Just to kind of quickly gloss over these two, they are important, obviously, but Whitefield, he was largely Calvinistic, and that would result in a bit of a falling out with him and Wesley, and Charles. And then Charles here, as I said, having been a prolific preacher, but as well best known for being a sermon writer, obviously most being known Hark Herald the Angels, or Hark the Herald Angels sing, Christ the Lord is risen today, and love divine, all loves excelling. So, in other words, anytime you go to a Christmas service at church, that's Charles Wesley's greatest hits being played. So, the formation of Methodism, once again going back, you have the Holy Club, influenced by the Moravian Brotherhood. Once again, going through all of that. Returning the Aldersgate, kind of a recap while we went over already. And moving on to how Methodism would evolve throughout American history. In I say the 17th century, 1700s. This is what I was thinking of when I did. I was not thinking, but in 1766, Philip Embury would start the first American Methodist Society in New York City. Well, New York, not New York City. I apologize, New York State at this point. The arrival of Francis Asbury in 1771. The Southern expansion during the Second Great Awakening. Kind of what you see there with the 4-to-1 church structure is that what you would oftentimes have in those early Methodist churches, and this is what caused such the Methodist church to grow so exponentially, is that you would have sort of one pastor, and he would go to a different church every week, and he would basically deliver the sacraments. He would do the whole priestly thing that only the priest could do, and then the other 3 weeks, that church would hold their services would essentially be a Sunday school. So you had essentially one pastor who was going to 4 churches over the course of a month, with going to one of 4 churches every week over the course of months of 4, right? And so you were able to, through this model, for every pastor or priest, you were able to then spread that guy out over 4 churches. That was one of the major factors that led to such the rapid exponential growth of Methodism in America. In the 18th century, you had the Second Great Awakening, and this is really when Methodism would get massive. This is actually more when the 4-to-1 would be seen. 1808, the Methodist Episcopal Church adopted sort of a delegation to the General Conference. Basically just sort of this more of a kind of a split where you're getting the central sort of hierarchical authority, as well as having the input of each member of the individual congregation also having power within the church structure. You would have the formation of new groups, the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1816, and then you would get a multitude of German churches. 19th century, you have this big shift from rural areas to more of a city area as urbanization became even bigger. The Methodist Church would keep branching off until 68, where you would have a sort of a merger that would lead to the United Methodist Conference, or United Methodist Church, I apologize, the formation of that. The main focus would be on the social gospel and community activism, a big focus on greater Christian education, so you'd have a lot more authorship of books and whatnot. To go back up, the main focus on social gospel and community activism. This is a huge thing with, as you can see, Martin Luther there. The Methodists were largely involved with both the civil rights movement as well as going back to the Civil War. They were involved very heavily with sort of the abolition of slavery. And just overall, them and the black church have been very heavily intertwined. And then you would also see a growth in regards to a focus on mission work internationally. And then you jump back into the 20th century, and you have the conflict with the UMC between the conservative and progressive church leaders. You do really have that split where the Methodist Church is really split down the middle. It's become very politicalized as well, but really you do have a big difference between a conservative progressive church leaders. This includes issues like the LGBTQ community, right? Saying, what is the degree of inclusion, especially when it comes to any sort of leadership position can you have, for instance, a gay pastor, right? This is a big thing. While not as common as the LGBTQ issues, there are some progressive churches that are sort of pseudo or sort of slightly pro-abortion in certain situations, and you have other social dynamics that kind of can cause conflict in the UMC. As I said before, social justice and civil rights involvement in the 1960s, as well as in the modern day, you see a lot of that today as well. And then you also have the utilization of technology. Really, this is something we see in most churches, but the Methodists seem to kind of pick up on it early on. Going back even to George Whitefield, he made big use of the printing press and all these things, right? And we kind of see that even today, where utilizing stuff like social media and all that to sort of spread the word. That was something that the Methodists were really quick in adapting and picking up. And finally, the impact of Methodism throughout the history of the church. As I said right here, once again, my face is in the way, I apologize, but it says Methodism's vast influence and impact on America comes as a result of it being at one point the largest denomination in America. I don't think it is anymore. I would believe, I don't know that for certain, but I believe it would be the Baptist now. But at one point, it was following the Second Great Awakening. And a big part of what gave it so much just impact in general is as much what it did as much as just how big it was. Right, naturally, you're just gonna have a lot of, when you have such a large volume, you're gonna get impacts out of it. But sort of as I said here, you have involvement in the abolition of slavery in the early black churches. Number two, I put as, this is not necessarily an impact, but something that can lead to that rapid growth that would then sort of turn into the impact, which would be a focus on individual connections with God, and just making overall a lot of Methodist theology is very individualistic, and as a result, it can make it for a little bit more of an approachable church dynamic, where you as an individual and sort of your personal connection with God is valued very highly. As I said, significant social and political involvement from the beginning. Methodism has always sort of been integrated with politics, with sort of social controversies, and just with the community, for better and for worse. And then kind of going back to number 4, I guess it kind of goes in with 1 and 3, but the Methodist Church was hugely involved in the civil rights movement, and just African Christians throughout American history, but especially, I think you probably see them the most in that period alongside the abolition period. So that's really all what I've got for Methodism. I think this is really the main big things that the cliff note points, without going into any sort of deeper research. That I think is kind of that surface level information that's really essential. So I hope you enjoy. Have a good one.